tonight's live stream. Thank you for taking the time to join us once again for our Cancel Student Debt panel discussion tonight. My name is Lynn Hua, and I'm a National Roots Action Organizer, formerly on the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team. Let's start off with talking about what, once again, PAC is. We are a political action committee organizing votes for Bernie in upcoming primary elections up until the Democratic National Convention in August. Our goal is to reach the 1,200 total delegate threshold that will allow platforms like student debt cancellation, Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and the end to for-profit war to head to the convention to be voted on. There are still 604 delegates left from now until August, and Bernie just needs about 150 more. So let's do all that we can to help him reach that 1,200 threshold. Tonight on this call, we'll go over our mission leading up to the August convention and why it's important to continue voting for Bernie in upcoming primary states in order to fight for student debt cancellation. Afterwards, we'll open up the floor for a panel discussion with experts and activists answering questions and discussing the importance of student debt cancellation. We are organizing to get these issues slated on the Democratic Party platform through Bernie's 1,200 delegate threshold, because platforms like student debt cancellation, Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, and the end to for-profit wars would radically transform the lives of working class people all over this country. And because it's time for Democrats to finally practice what they preach through long-lasting policy rather than performative solidarity. More than 45 million Americans are trapped with a $1.7 trillion debt sentence, and especially during the pandemic, with millions losing their jobs and already struggling to pay rent, it is imperative that we cancel all student loan payments for the duration of the crisis. We must lift this burden and cancel student debt payments for the duration of the crisis. Absolutely. Even beyond the pandemic, we must cancel all student debt and make public colleges, universities, and trade schools tuition-free and debt-free, because we want an educated population that has the ability to achieve social mobility and a brighter future with their hard work. But that's not possible when there are many who can't afford to go to school. Like myself, school has become a business. College prices are so outrageously high that it makes it impossible to support yourself through school without taking out a predatory loan or the privilege of money itself. In addition, our racial wealth gap is both the biggest and has grown the fastest among those with a college education, primarily due to student loans. On top of paying wages that await students after they graduate and enter the job market, prolonging the burden of debt for decades. By canceling student debt, we can stimulate the economy from the ground up and make it possible for America's educated population to pursue a brighter future, including careers helping the most vulnerable among us without the debilitating weight of debt. I'll pass it over now to my co-host Lakshmi, who will introduce herself and kick off our panel discussion tonight. Lakshmi?
Thanks, Lynn. Hey everyone, my name is Lakshmi Gopal, and I'm a National Roots Action Organizer and formerly on the Bernie 2020 National Organizing Team, focusing on distributed canvassing. And we're gonna open up the floor and begin our cancel student debt discussion. Tonight, we're honored to be joined by some advocates in education, student rights, and the student debt cancellation movement. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our panelists for the night, starting off with Meleiza Figueroa, a national coordinator for the Cancel Student Debt Campaign. She is a PhD candidate in geography at UC Berkeley and spent 2 years in the Amazon researching indigenous agroforestry and its lessons for sustainable development. She is a faculty owner of the Cooperative New School for Urban Studies and Environmental Justice, a fellow with the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution, and currently works on native-led ecosystem restoration, management, and environmental workforce development with the Chico Traditional Ecological Stewardship Program and the Intertribal Stewardship Workforce Initiative in Northern California. She has been a long-time political journalist, educator, and organizer involved in a wide range of movements for social and environmental justice. And she is an on-air correspondent for Free Speech TV's Rising Up with the media. Next, we have Shana Gallagher, the former National Student Organizing Director for Bernie 2020. She and her team designed and launched and managed the campaign's national student organizing program known as Students for Bernie. This program was responsible for training over 5,000 students in all 50 states and Puerto Rico and recruiting over 2,600 campus corps leaders. These CCLs contributed 10 hours per week to the campaign as student volunteer organizers and identified over 150,000 voters. We're also joined by Delaney Vandergrift, who is currently a growth strategist for Dream Defenders. Formerly, she was the National HBCU Organizing Manager for Bernie 2020, organizing historically Black colleges and universities for Bernie. She's always had a deep passion for Black students and HBCUs. Growing up in North Carolina and being the daughter of HBCU alumni, she understands how essential HBCUs are to the fabric of this country and for education and community to Black people across the nation. And then there's Joseline Garcia, daughter of Mexican Guatemalan immigrants, a sister to two younger brothers, and a 26-year-old working class American. Her organizing career began as a student organizer where she was empowered by her peers with the tools and knowledge to become an agent of change. She believes that change will come directly from the people and has dedicated herself to develop the new generation of progressive leaders. As the former California and New York student organizing manager for Bernie 2020 campaign and the president of the United States Student Association. And lastly, we have Thomas Gokey, who's a visual artist and co-founder of the Debt Collective. He was an adjunct professor at Syracuse University and has an MFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and is currently a PhD candidate at the EGS in Switzerland. The project of Strike Debt, which purchases pennies on the dollar. Strike Debt is an offshoot of Occupy Wall Street, which seeks to build a global debt resistance movement, including student debt. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this panel discussion. It's so wonderful to have you here with us tonight talking about an issue as important as student debt. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the discussion with just an opening question, and anyone can hop in and we'll just have an open conversation about student debt, student advocacy, and how to mobilize students. So my first question is, what would this country look like if we were able to cancel student debt? What would that mean for students, for families, for upward mobility? What would that look like?
I guess I can kick it off. One of the things about student debt, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. One of the things about student debt, the average monthly payment that people usually pay for student debt is about $400 a month. So it's actually quite easy to think about what your life would be like if you had $400 a month that you had in your pocket that you didn't have to pay to a debtor, right? And I think that means a lot more than people think. $400, it doesn't feel like much. But if you think about, and I know a lot of young people, I'm not that young, but, a lot of folks who are, trying to start their lives, they're in that age range where you're supposed to start your life. You're supposed to establish yourself, have a family, all of that. There's a lot, 60% of Americans are $400 away from bankruptcy, right? They cannot sustain a $400 emergency. I mean, that number, $400, is really, really important because, that is literally that can be the margin between, a continued way of life and economic catastrophe for some people. And, that has a lot of mental health effects as well as, actual, like, can I pay for things? I think financial anxiety is one of the things that is most overlooked you know, and I think that especially for people who are just in that time when you're supposed to do the things that you're supposed to do and you don't have the resources to do it, $400 actually means a whole lot. And so I'll pass it on to other folks who can speak to that experience.
Thank you, Mel. I'll just add that, you know, in a time when there's a global pandemic happening and the federal government just awarded over $1 trillion to business interests and corporate interests, that actually forgiving, over $1 trillion, that forgiving a little bit over $1 trillion in student debt would actually be a huge boost to the economy right now, and a much needed one. And a lot of studies show that it would add an estimated $108 billion per year for the next 10 years to our GDP, as well as creating millions of jobs. So it definitely would create a lot of positive changes for our economy and for so many people and their families struggling with student debt right now.
I guess I would just add that it's hard to underestimate the psychological toll that student debt takes on people. That every day we talk to people who are just absolutely crushed by this burden, and to be able to relieve that burden. I mean, I saw somebody recently online saying, "Can you imagine the party in the streets when we cancel all student debt?" And I certainly hope there are parties in the street, but I'm also going to get the first good night's sleep of my adult life. And we talk a lot about the economic impact of the student debt. The average graduate has about $35,000 worth of debt, but that doesn't really factor in the opportunity that costs that come along with it, of not being able to save a little bit of money because every penny that you have is already being stolen by Betsy DeVos. When you factor in the opportunity cost for the average household, the student debt ends up costing closer to $250,000. So it would be a massive, massive burden lifted off of 45 million people. And it's not just young people. The fastest growing demographic of people with student debt are people over 55 years old, people who are having their Social Security garnished to pay their student debt. The psychological burden, in addition to the economic burden, is just massive.
Hi, everyone. If I could add a couple of things as well, and also thank you to everyone for being a part of this space, and also shout out to the other panelists for also joining us. I totally resonate with what the other panelists have said in terms of the, not just thinking about the financial impacts, but also the mental health impacts that come with having student debt. And a lot of the people that I've worked with over the past couple years in the Bernie campaign, but also with USSA, the United States Student Association, it's with the students at the moment who are accumulating that debt and haven't necessarily graduated already. And since we're talking about, you know, trying to also get delegates at the DNC, and, you know, a lot of us are coming off from a campaign where we were able to work with thousands of students. If we were not to have student debt, I can guarantee you that students would be involved in politics, would be involved in their communities a lot more, because many, many times in the Bernie campaign, but also even before then, and in my own experience as a student organizer at UC Santa Barbara, I saw so many times students who cared about issues were not able to participate and engage and be at the forefront of issues that they should be, because they had to work and balance multiple different jobs. because they could barely afford rent because of how ridiculous tuition was, because they were also food insecure. So by canceling student debt, we also open up the door for this generation to be able to reach its best potential when it comes to actually getting involved. And I truly believe that when it comes to issues, the people who are impacted the most should be at the forefront, at the fight, right? They should be the decision makers. And student debt prevents students from being able to do that. In particular, Black and Brown students, because Black and Brown students is the population that is specifically impacted by student debt in a very specific way.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, talking about the folks that are the most impacted by student debt, Black women have the most student debt. And when we think about the families that Black folks are a part of, recognizing that Black people don't have generational wealth. So when folks are leaving college, there's not an inheritance that families can share with their children. There's not just a random pot of money that's just available. So when you get out of college, you can't be risky with your job. Like you can't be creative and innovative, because if you don't pay your student loan debt and you default, or your credit's ruined, your life is potentially over, because that's what debt does. So canceling all student debt would give Black people in general an opportunity that we haven't had to have any sort of economic mobility, whatever that really means. But it would give us at least a little bit of an opportunity.
Definitely. I feel like, personally, I'm a first generation American, and I can remember being 5 or 6 and having my dad just push the idea of scholarships or like getting money for school, and already embedding the idea that you can't accumulate debt, or like you should try to avoid it, just understanding fully the impact it would have on me, on my peers, as far as the setbacks that would occur. And so definitely personally feel a lot of what you all just described, the mental health component, the economic liberation that is limited there. And so that the feelings and the personal impact of canceling student debt is something you all just touched on. And I would like to move that into infrastructure. So politically, oftentimes we're told, like, how can we do that? There's not enough money. We don't have the budget for that. How are we able to navigate it? And so just curious your thoughts on the political landscape and how can we be able to push politicians, people in power, in shifting them to understand fully what you just described, the mental health component, the economic liberation that's necessary for this country.
I guess I can kick off that discussion again. So I'm the national coordinator for the Cancel Student Debt Campaign. It's a national effort that was convened by initially 2 organizations. One was Freedom to Prosper, who has backed a lot of the research that is going into the impacts of student debt, as well as the practical means by which our governments and our lawmakers can actually make student debt cancellation possible. And so it was initially convened by Freedom to Prosper, as well as Progressive Democrats of America. And then we brought in Debt Collective and a number of other organizations, including faculty organizations and student organizations. And we've begun a process because we started to realize that a lot of organizations are working on this very critical issue, especially because it is such a it's such a detriment and a barrier to looking at to taking on a lot of these other issues that some of you mentioned. And so one of the things that the student debt Cancel Student Debt campaign has done is on a number of fronts. We do grassroots organizing as well as directly sending letters to lawmakers and making people aware of the research and the really good work that's already been done out there. And so, we invite people to check out Cancel Student Debt campaign and, start this process where all of us who are working on this issue in one way or another can start to talk together and coordinate together and share ideas. The meetings that we've been having have been very rich in terms of not just, what we can do to agitate for change, but also to sort of read the changing landscape. I mean, the fact that $10,000 of student debt cancellation is on the table right now with the stimulus is extraordinary. And, these are very, the times are changing very quickly, and it's good to have an organization or a group of organizations, right, that come from different perspectives that can talk together to see what we can do in this moment. Right now it is kind of seat of your pants organizing, but it's also very exciting times because a lot more is possible than has been in the past.
I can jump in here in terms of, what can we do? I will admit that, as the former National Student Organizing Director on the campaign, I worked with a lot of students. I am by no means an expert on student debt relative to a lot of the other experts on this panel. And like Joseline said, shout out to all of you for being here and enlightening us tonight. I can definitely speak to the energy and galvanization that I saw amongst the thousands of Students for Bernie volunteers who were a part of our program because student debt is haunting them and their families and their parents and their grandparents to such an extreme degree. But I'll just say that when I was doing some research in preparation for this panel, I found out some very interesting information that I would love to share tonight, which is that speaking of, what can we do, what stands in the way, the American Council on Education, which is a group of basically lobbying interests that represent higher education and loan corporations and groups, did actually suggest that Congress did not cancel all student debt, especially during the pandemic. They have the power to do that under the Higher Education Act, and that's something that within the Department of Education, the federal government does have the ability to cancel all student debt, which again, as I mentioned earlier, would be a huge boon to the economy in this moment, potentially. But the American Council on Education shockingly suggested that the federal government does not do that, and they focus on more immediate term solutions for students who are struggling and basically passed the potato, as we say in campaign world, or indicated that it was a cost that these loan providers should not pay, but the federal government in other ways should pay. And again, you probably won't be surprised to hear that the American Council on Education is funded by people like the Koch brothers, funded by Deloitte, Fidelity Investments, Salesforce, and most importantly, Navient, which is one of the three groups that actually provides and manages 90% of federal student loans. And so all of this to say, I'm sure anyone watching this call right now understands that our campaign finance system and our democracy are highly influenced by special interests and groups that have a lot of money to influence decisions that are made. And that definitely is the case for decisions that are made about student loan debt as well. And so in terms of how can we advocate, how can we really affect change, I would point to the current movement for Black Lives and the disruption that we're seeing in the streets, and actually just say that as an organizer, especially one who comes from a direct action background, I really believe that disruption is the only and best way that we can advocate for the real changes that we know that we want and need.
And the person who's in charge of the American Council of Education, this lobbyist group, is Ted Mitchell, who was the undersecretary of the Department of Education under Obama. We fought against Ted Mitchell tooth and nail to win over $1 billion worth of fraudulent debt discharge from for-profit universities. So he's still fighting us. And we need to make sure that if there is a Biden administration, Ted Mitchell is not a part of it. Has no place in the Department of Education. When we first started organizing and we said, we want fully publicly funded public universities and colleges, and we want a jubilee for all student debt, we were told that we were insane. This was pie in the sky. It was unrealistic. But now there is legislation in Congress to do just that in both the House and the Senate. Bernie introduced the Senate version. But that would have to pass through Congress, and that's sort of an uphill battle, right? But the Congress has already granted the Secretary of Education the authority to do what is called compromise and settle any federal student loan for any reason or no reason whatsoever, and they made that authority very broad. So the next administration could, with one signature, cancel 97% of all student debt, basically all federal student debt. So if you still have federal student loans 1 year from now, there is one reason and only one reason, and that is that the next administration wants you to be in debt. And I wholeheartedly second the idea that we are going to need to disrupt the system. This is not going to happen if we just vote and sit back and let politicians do what they're going to do. We're going to have to do this for them. We're going to have to fight tooth and nail in order to win every penny of discharge. And we can. So we're encouraging everyone. It can be dangerous to default on your student loans as an individual, and we don't want people to do that. We don't want people to commit financial suicide. But even before the pandemic, 1 million people were defaulting every single year. There already is a kind of debt strike going on. Even before the pandemic, over 55% of people with student debt were not paying their student loans. And for many of them, there were safe ways to do that. You're either in forbearance or in deferment, or you're in one of the income-driven repayment plans where your monthly payment is reduced to $0. We want to organize everyone to find a safe way to reduce your payment to zero and join a debt strike. And you can go to strike.debtcollective.org to join the strike. Right now, as a result of the CARES Act, there is a temporary moratorium on most, not all, but most federal student loan payments and interest. So for the time being, it's safe for most people to join the strike. So the way I see it is that Joe Biden might not want to cancel our debt, but the next administration is going to inherit a Great Depression, and there is going to need to be economic stimulus. And Mitch McConnell has promised to be the Grim Reaper for any progressive legislation. Canceling student debt is something that Joe Biden could do that Mitch McConnell couldn't stop, and it would stimulate the economy, in addition to all of the other necessary reasons that this needs to be done. This isn't just realistic. We're getting to the point where there is no other option. If we're going to keep the economy from collapsing, we're going to need to cancel all of this debt.
Thank you, Thomas. And I also want to add that, this canceling student debt is not just a progressive wish list issue. There are polls out there. It's a Hill-Harris-X poll in 2019 that showed that, canceling student debt is a hugely popular issue among bipartisan voters. So across the spectrum, people are seeing the necessity of student loan cancellation because of the reality that so many people are living in this trap. And so, one of the things that we've been talking about in this Cancel Student Debt campaign is to, is to point that out, that this is not a partisan issue. This is not just somebody's sort of wish list. The possibilities are out there. The numbers are out there. If you go to freedomtoprosper.org/resources, all of the studies are there that shows not just about the economic benefit, but also, how they can do it. And as Thomas said, with the stroke of a pen. And just want to point out too, that there is already legislation that is pending in Congress that has been introduced by Representative Ilhan Omar and co-sponsored by 12 House members. It's HR 3448, which is the Student Debt Cancellation Act of 2019. Right now, it's just sitting, right? It's stuck in committee. But with enough grassroots pressure, with enough of a disruptive force, and even as Thomas said, just with economic circumstances alone, this could force the issue in the open. The mechanisms are there. It just needs our grassroots political pressure to put it over the top.
Definitely. There are so many just unnecessary roadblocks to canceling student debt. And one of the reasons that once again has come about, especially post-Bernie campaign, is really to get folks to continue to vote for him in the primary and gain delegates so that we can push platforms like canceling student debt at the Democratic National Convention. And you all just described many other political agitation moments. I want to go back to what Shayna was describing around just street mobilization and direct action, and kick it off to Joseline and Delaney, who led just very specific student organizing on the Bernie campaign and had so many just wins overall in mobilizing students, in politically educating students, but also utilizing that student energy, that interest in a better world, and getting folks to be politically involved. And so I'm so curious as to what would mobilizing students to work towards canceling student debt look like?
Yeah, I was really shocked when we started the HBCU program, and instead of some of the more popular, I think, issues that students think about, like free college, right? It's usually I want to go to school for free, not often debt cancellation, that I felt like was popular in conversations with current students. A lot of them were saying debt cancellation because of their relationships with their families and seeing how their mothers and their fathers were impacted solely because of student debt, thinking that because they went to school, it would give them a pathway to economic mobility and to a different sort of future, but recognizing that maybe that's a myth for Black folks and brown people and poor white folks. And what I think is that there has to be an understanding to catch students early and while they're in school, to get them to not necessarily get excited, but to activate them around that issue, around a forward thinking campaign. In the moment, I think even when I was a student, thinking about not having to pay tuition the next year was incredible. And I didn't think about the student debt that I would have because it's not in front of you. So I think right now, the most important thing that I think organizers should be doing is really speaking truth to power and explaining to people what debt actually does to you in the future, and going to college campuses and having those conversations that I'm not sure a lot of folks have until you do your exit report and you talk to counselors when you're about to graduate.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Lakshmi. And I totally agree with Delaney. So I've organized around student debt in my capacity as president of the United States Student Association, and also when I was a student. And I want to piggyback what Thomas had said earlier, that the movement of student debt, and the whole narrative around canceling student debt, it's been a very long road to get there. When I was a student back in 2012 through 2016, we weren't talking about canceling student debt to the extent right now. We weren't even talking about free college, y'all. So the UCs, they were raising our tuition every other year, and we were saying, end the tuition hike. And then we started saying, roll back the tuitions. And then until I was a senior, which is when Bernie actually introduced his College for All Act with USSA, and also when he ran for the first bid, that's when we started to say free college and also cancel student debt. And it's been a mission to get here. And a lot of people, as was mentioned earlier, were very hesitant about getting on board for canceling student debt. And so I think what's really important right now is that when we're talking to not only young people and current students, but also those who have graduated or even others who are older, we really have to hone into the narrative that canceling student debt is not a radical thing, and that it's very realistic and very possible, as other colleagues have said, because we're going to kick ourselves in the butt if we lose that narrative and people start settling back to another narrative, right? And we're in a point right now where that narrative of canceling student debt is popular, and so we need to hold on to that vision. The other thing that I would say is really important in terms of organizing and direct action is that something that, we really struggled with in USSA, and I got a little bit easier with the Bernie campaign, is that often people would think that young students and just young people in general, when it came to organizing, people would think like you're either fighting for education or you're fighting for undocumented students in DACA, you're fighting for Black lives, you're fighting for housing, you're fighting for the Green New Deal. Well, at the time it wasn't the Green New Deal, but you're fighting for, against climate change. So it was an either or situation. And education is your right. It is not a privilege. And student debt is a very, very intersectional issue that impacts multiple different communities and issues in very different ways. So something that we should be very proactive about is building those coalitions that were mentioned earlier with those who are fighting on student debt, and also those who are fighting on housing, fighting for the Green New Deal, fighting for Black lives, fighting for undocumented folks. We should talk about how is that gonna impact you, right? Because we need to be a united front, y'all. And people who are against us, they rely on us coming at each other. They rely on us saying, we can't fight this fight right now because we need to put this first. We need to be intersectional with these things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. One of the things that I've been thinking about as I'm hearing all of you talk, and, especially as someone who I went to undergrad as a low-income student of color, first generation, people don't understand the experience. They think, oh, you chose to go into debt, so you need to be responsible for it. They don't understand how hard it is, just to be a student in general, but also to be, a low-income student of color in a college campus. A lot of the college structures, right, from tuition, but also all the way down, sort of have this assumption of a white middle-class student that isn't true for a lot of students that come there. I had the Cadillac of scholarships, and I still had to take out loans. Why? Because say you are invited to go to a conference, okay, your department might pay some of it after you take out all of the costs. You assume all the costs yourself of going to a conference. You want to go do research somewhere, you have to pay for that too. the cost of housing, the cost of, doing an internship. All of those are costs that people don't assume are the costs of college. They think cost of college is just tuition, food, and room and board. But the books are super expensive. The equipment that you need to succeed in school is super expensive. And when you're somebody who is struggling, even if you get all of those scholarships, it's never enough. And if and if you're walking on campus and you're stressed out about, like, I can't participate or excel in school the way other people are because their mommies and daddies can pay for stuff, and then you walk by this table that's just open to you saying, hey, come get a student loan, what do you think people are going to do, right? The predatory nature of student loan companies, of credit card companies, is intense on college campuses, and that's something that we need to talk about as well. And it does fit into all of these different intersectional issues, because your ability to succeed on a college campus, it does cost money, and we need to talk about that. And that's one of the reasons why people do get into student loan debt, even if they do everything they can to not take out that loan. You're still going to have to at some point in your college career, right?
If I can really jump in very quickly. So a couple of years ago, I was actually a negotiator with the Department of Education, and we were negotiating a new version of the borrower defense rule, which is meant to protect a lot of students from predatory loans and institutions, right? And I'll tell you, I'm gonna be straight up, in those meetings, we had representatives from multiple different institutions, including private schools, trade schools, but also loan. And one of the narratives that people would throw out there about students is the one that was just mentioned, that students, they use their loan money to go buy groceries at Whole Foods. They use their money to go get a new fancy car, right? So there is a narrative that people who profit off of student debt that are spreading about students right now, right? And they're spreading that narrative to decision makers who get to decide what happens with student debt, right? And so when we're organizing, in addition to holding onto the vision that canceling student debt is necessary, we also need to hold onto the vision and the reality that many students are currently facing. They're not going to Whole Foods with their student loan money. They're not buying new fancy cars, right? They're barely trying to make the rent, barely trying to buy food. And so it's important that, we check people on these things, because there are others who are getting ahead of us and spreading this false narrative.
I guess, sorry, I just want to jump in with one last thing too. In terms of on-campus organizing, one of the sort of campus populations that get overlooked a lot, but I think is very critical in terms of the connection of, like, students who are not necessarily facing the burden of student debt, while they're in school, is, to look at adjunct professors and lecturers and early career teachers. Because a lot of the teachers right now, and, I've worked as an adjunct professor, I know 75% of the academic workforce right now is contingent adjunct labor, which are instructors and people who have gone through their whole college career to be paid poverty wages for 1 or 2 classes. Some of them teach 4 or 5 classes just to make ends meet, and they are the ones who are on the hook right now for student debt. So if you're organizing on a campus and students may not sort of understand what happens after, just look at your teachers sometimes. Lecturers and adjuncts especially are facing the burden of student debt, even as they are being woefully underpaid. They are not getting any workplace protections, and they are, in many ways doing the jobs that people who are students aspire to do. And so, I think that we do have some faculty associations in the Cancel Student Debt Coalition. Your teachers care a lot about this, and many of the teachers care about it, and are really willing to help to fight for it. So I guess I'm just put in my 2 cents for the teachers as well, because especially a lot of early career faculty are impacted very, very adversely by student debt loads.
Thank you all. That was, wow, just so much information. And I'm feeling just frustrated that the powers that be and the decision makers are, again, creating those roadblocks, and like Joseline just described, are in these meetings and not listening to folks, not prioritizing what students need, and not allowing for upward mobility, economic liberation, all of these things. I would love if we talked about what if we were in a world in which student debt has been canceled. And I know we are lucky enough on this panel to have folks who directly organize with students. What would be the other things that students would be organizing around? I think it's really important. Like, we've talked about how intersectional canceling student debt is, and what the impact itself would be on individuals as well as the political landscape, and how people can maneuver within our particular economy. And so I think it's important that folks understand the complexities of student organizing and what people could pay attention to, what students could be mobilized to do if they did not have the weight of debt on them.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, so thinking about HBCU students specifically, I think that if student debt was canceled, there would be a campaign to fully fund HBCUs to begin with. And I also think that there would be, at the same time, a free college campaign like there is now, but with much more intensity. In this moment, thinking about all the HBCUs, I think there's 103. A lot of them are right on the brink of closing, and COVID-19 is making it so that a lot of them maybe won't reopen, or are going to reopen halfway. And this means that a lot of those students that would be going are not going to go back. And private HBCUs that have tuition that is super high because it's absolutely necessary, because their endowments aren't like those of Harvard's and Yale's and the Princetons. The tuition just has to be high. But if our state and our federal government made a commitment to Black education and Black people to fully fund HBCUs, we could have a totally different conversation around what it looks like for communities that have been marginalized and left behind to get an education that makes sense, that's culturally relevant right now.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Lakshmi, because I want to give another shout out to Delaney and the Dream Defenders Sunday School event that I attended today. And Dr. Angela Davis was talking about how the Abolish and Defund the Police campaign is really so much more than just the negatives. It's the positives, right, of what we're reinvesting in and what that will allow us to do for our communities and uplift all these other social services that have been defunded for so long. And I think it's very similar with canceling student debt. Cancel seems like a negative word. It's easy for Republicans and honestly Democrats to say, oh, we don't want to be painted with the socialist brush, so we're not going to do that. But really, exactly like you said, it would allow for students to be engaged with so much more on campus and in our society. And I am projecting right now because my motivating issue is climate change, but I do think that students and young people understand that all of these crises are completely compounding, right? The coronavirus crisis, the student debt crisis, and the climate crisis, and that we will be the generation that has to deal with the consequences of failed leadership and lack of taking responsibility of all these prior generations. And students and young people do really understand the urgency of this crisis, the need to act, and could be doing a lot more to tackle climate change if they were freed of these chains of crippling student debt that they're dealing with now.
The main question that we always want people to ask themselves and to have us ask together is, what do we really owe and to whom? Right? Sometimes people think that what we're trying to do is create a society without any debt at all. But that's not true, because a debt is fundamentally a social bond. And maybe the debt that I owe you is that if you get sick or hurt, you should be able to get the healthcare that you need. Right? That is a debt that we're currently defaulting on that we can afford to pay. Young people deserve a livable future. We deserve a planet that survives. The United States is very, very good at certain kinds of debt resistance. I think we should have in terms of canceling illegitimate debts, we should be paying our legitimate debts, including reparations for slavery. This is a debt that we have not only refused to pay, but often just refused to acknowledge even exists out there on the balance sheet. So I get excited about framing this in positive terms, of looking at what kinds of bonds we want to have with each other, what kinds of promises we want to make with each other, and that unfortunately our current system is very, very far from a genuine democracy. But in a genuine democracy, it's all of us working together, figuring out how we want to link ourselves to each other.
Absolutely. I think, again, one of the things about student debt and, the issues that we can focus on if student debt were to be canceled is also some of the structural inequalities within the college system and society at large that makes people have to take out loans in the first place. I'm glad that you talked about the Green New Deal and environment. As an environmental educator, I love field classes. I would teach field classes all day if I could, and universities can be pressured to have appropriate educational tools for the skills that we're going to need in the future, especially and also in terms of representation of instructors and faculty of color, as well as curriculum that is culturally appropriate. These are things too that again can lead to employment for people who are college educated and people of color who can't find jobs, who can't get tenure right now. These are other types of fights on campus that are absolutely would be well people are fighting for them now, but imagine with it being freed from a financial anxiety that students feel every day, the types of structural changes that we can fight for in the university is also very, very important. Student debt is just one part of a neoliberal transformation of the university that has gone on over the last several decades. And the predatory debt that goes along with it is part and parcel of how universities are structured nowadays. I think that if we're freed of this financial emergency that we have to face every month when our bills are due, and the student loan bills are due, I think that that would free up a lot of energy to sort of look at the college environment in general and how we can make it more equitable and more accessible to everybody.
Wow, I feel just immensely inspired and excited for a future that is geared by and led by you all who are doing this work, who are organizing students, who are making sure that the individuals who are decision makers, the politicians, elected officials are being held accountable, are not allowing bills to just sit, that Congress is doing their job. There's just so many points of agitation here and shifting of power that we can be doing, and I feel so inspired, especially for that, the answers to that last question, where what could we be doing if we did not have to work to cancel student debt? And so it just really shows the importance of getting it done and getting it done right now. There's no better time to do this. And so I just want to thank you all for joining us for this conversation, hopping on this panel, really doing a deep dive on why canceling student debt is important, why making sure to center student needs so that they are seen, that they are valued, that they have power to really mobilize for the things that they want. And so canceling student debt, it's a roadblock. We need to do it. We need to make sure that we're investing in this. And so if you all want to join, there have been organizations and different calls to action as to how you can get involved in the canceling student debt world. And then you can also join us and sign up at onceagainpact.com. So we hope that this has been a thoroughly informative and inspiring discussion for everyone tuning in tonight. Just be sure to follow all of our amazing speakers on their journeys. They are just so informative, so inspiring, and doing the work of making sure that students are valued, that folks have the opportunity to participate in this economy, that they are just given a chance, a fighting chance, right? And so that's what everybody deserves. So thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, not me, us. Bye.